year was 1347. It began, as many great calamities do, quietly. Somewhere near the shores of the Black Sea, a merchant ship unfurled its sails and drifted westward toward Sicily, its cargo hold heavy not only with goods, but with something far more sinister: rats, fleas, and something no one yet had a name for. When the ship arrived in Messina, the docks fell still. The sailors aboard were dying. Their skin was mottled, bruised with strange black blotches, and their groans were slow and sickly. No one knew it yet, but this was the beginning of what would be known as the Black Death, a plague that would, over the next few years, kill nearly half of Europe's population. But this is not the story of the plague. This is the story of what followed it, of those strange, shuffling figures who moved silently through towns and villages, wrapped in black robes and leather gloves, their faces hidden behind unnervingly long, beaked masks. They seemed like spirits from a fevered dream, like death itself come walking, the plague doctor. To many, the image is familiar. A figure of nightmares with a mask shaped like a bird's beak, glassy round eyes, and a black hat. Popular culture has turned it into a symbol of horror, of mystery, of the Middle Ages' brutal medical ignorance. But beneath that mask lies a far stranger, more unsettling truth, because plague doctors were never what you think. For one, the beaked mask, that eerie avian disguise, was not worn at the start of the Black Death at all. In fact, it wouldn't appear for nearly 300 years. When the plague first tore across Europe, physicians didn't even know what a bacterium was. They believed in miasma's bad air, corrupt vapors that flowed through the atmosphere, bringing disease to those who breathed them in. And so, the treatment of illness was largely a matter of smells. Sweet smells to counteract the bad ones, vinegar and rosewater, burning herbs. And later, when the mask was finally devised, it would be stuffed with a blend of fragrant substances, mint, cloves, camphor, or even crushed lavender. But that mask wasn't protection. Not really. It was ritual. Symbol. Theater. You see, the plague doctor wasn't a doctor in the way we understand the word today. In most towns, a plague doctor was a hired official, often not even trained in medicine, brought in from outside because no local healer dared risk their own life. They were scribes, witnesses, sometimes just bodies with a contract. Promised a fixed salary and lodging if they agreed to stay among the infected and count the dead. Their job wasn't to cure. It was to observe, to record, to keep their distance and try not to die, and yet these men became legend. Perhaps it was the costume. Perhaps it was their association with death, the way their arrival in a town often marked the official acknowledgement of an outbreak. When the plague doctor came, you knew it was real, and you knew the dying had only begun. The outfit itself would emerge in the early 17th century, attributed to Charles Delorme, a French physician to royal families. He designed it like armor head to toe in waxed fabric, with a long overcoat, leather gloves, boots, and that famous beaked mask. The eyes were covered with glass lenses. The beak, curved and hollow, protruded like a predator's snout. To modern eyes, it looks monstrous. But it wasn't meant to be terrifying. It was meant to be protective. And yet, in a strange twist of irony, it offered very little real protection at all. The fabric, soaked in wax, might have helped keep some fleas at bay. The gloves and mask may have slowed transmission from coughing patients. But nothing they wore could stop Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that carried death in its tiny claws. And nothing they carried, no pouch of herbs, no cane used to poke and prod from a distance, could change the fate of the towns they visited. Still, they came. In city after city, as outbreaks resurfaced Florence, Vienna, London, they arrived in silence. Scribbling notes, counting bodies, performing autopsies with trembling hands. Often they were feared. Sometimes they were attacked. In one case, a plague doctor was thrown into the street and beaten to death by villagers who believed he had brought the disease with him. Over time, the image of the plague doctor began to change. From a figure of duty, he became a figure of dread. Street artists in Venice and Paris drew them with exaggerated features. Satirists mocked them. Children told stories of plague doctors who snatched the living, not the dead. A kind of folkloric horror began to grow around the beaked mask, until it was no longer a symbol of medicine at all, but of fear incarnate. And yet, the truth remained buried beneath the myth. Because what the plague doctor truly represented was the slow, fumbling grasp of a civilization trying to understand death. These were men caught between superstition and science, between ritual and reality. They wrote down symptoms with quill and ink. They watched mothers bury infants. They burned clothes. They cut buboes open with razors and waited for signs of life. Most of them died. Those who didn't carried the stench of suffering with them for the rest of their days, but still they wore the mask. Not because it worked, but because it was something. In a time when no one knew how to fight the plague, not even the smartest minds of Europe, wearing a costume, however ridiculous, felt like resistance, a gesture against the void. And that is where we begin. In the next chapter, we'll travel further into the early years of the plague. We'll explore the first mentions of these strange physicians, and how desperation, not medical knowledge, created a role that would soon become the darkest icon of medieval illness. Long before the plague doctor became a silhouette of folklore, before the beak and the black robes turned into nightmares sewn into history, there were healers. Ordinary physicians, barber surgeons, herbalists, priests, all living comfortably in the towns and cities of Europe, treating fevers, boils, and coughs with leeches, poultices, and prayer. And then death arrived. It didn't look like death at first. It began with a fever, then chills, swelling in the armpits and groin, lumps that grew hard and blackened. The skin darkened, then ruptured. Blood pooled beneath the surface. The sick groaned and cried out. They coughed blood, and then they died, sometimes in hours, sometimes in days, but always in agony. In the great cities, Florence, Avignon, London, the plague spread so fast that no one understood what was happening. One day, the baker's wife was serving loaves. The next, she was dead in the gutter, her body bloated and swarmed by flies. Entire families vanished within a week, streets filled with moaning bodies. And the healers, they left. It is one of the quiet horrors of this story. The physicians' men trained in the arts of Hippocrates and Galen fled their posts. They packed their manuscripts and ran to the countryside, locking themselves behind wooden doors, far from the smell of the sick. In Avignon, nearly all the doctors vanished. The Pope, Clement VI, was left to fend for himself, issuing desperate decrees while seated between two roaring fires, believing the flames would purify the air. There was logic in their fear. Medicine in the 14th century was largely ceremonial, a matter of balance, blood and bile, heat and moisture. There were no antibiotics, no microscopes, no real understanding of contagion. And so, when the pestilence came, doctors were as helpless as their patients. The robe did not protect. The knowledge did not cure. Only isolation worked. But when the learned men left the cities, a vacuum formed, a chilling absence of order. That was when the strange replacements began to appear. They came not from the elite universities, but from the outside. Often from smaller towns or from among the less reputable. Some were trained. Most were not. They were hired by local councils out of desperation, signed to fixed contracts. These were not healers. They were record keepers, witnesses, scapegoats. They would become known in time as Medici della Peste, the plague doctors. Their duties were simple: observe the sick, count the dead, carry messages between isolated communities, note symptoms. Occasionally lance boils or bleed a patient, though most knew it did little good. They were instructed to touch no one, remain detached, and maintain physical distance. A cold job in the heart of the fire, they wore what was available: thick cloaks, often waxed, scarves soaked in vinegar, masks fashioned from cloth or leather, sometimes soaked with herbs or tobacco smoke. But none of it worked. By the end of each outbreak, most plague doctors died alongside the people they were sent to monitor. And yet they kept appearing, because cities needed them not to cure, but to acknowledge the crisis. The arrival of a plague doctor was an official sign that the pestilence had been recognized, that a town had entered its final stage of desperation, that records would now be kept and burials logged, and that someone, somewhere, was watching. Some of these doctors left behind journals. One wrote of holding a young girl's hand as her skin blackened. Another described how the corpses of the infected were too dangerous to bury with Christian rites, and were instead thrown into mass graves with no markers. Another wrote only numbers, day after day, tallying the dead. It was not glamorous work. There was no glory in it. No celebration. And yet, with each new wave of plague, the role was revived. In Venice, doctors were stationed at Lazaretto's plague quarantine islands, where they watched from afar as ships anchored offshore, flags hoisted in warning. In Marseille, one doctor insisted on dissecting the bodies of plague victims to find the source of the disease. He died 2 weeks later. In London, parish records were updated daily by doctors who could barely hold a quill due to trembling. Sometimes these men were paid handsomely, but more often they were promised money that never came, or lodging in houses that had already been claimed by the rats. Their contracts were forgotten when the plague ended. Many were buried in unmarked graves alongside those they had counted. But perhaps the strangest irony was this: even as people feared the doctors crossed themselves as they passed, spit in their direction. Locked doors behind them, many also believed they brought hope, not healing, but recognition. A sense that the crisis had form, that it could be measured, that someone was trying. And so the paradox was born. The plague doctor was both feared and needed, ridiculed and respected. Their presence meant you were not alone in your suffering. And yet, their presence also meant that death had come. In the next chapter, we will explore the moment the beak arrived, when the eerie costume that now defines them was first imagined not out of medieval superstition, but from the mind of a 17th century physician who believed that death could be filtered through fragrance. It did not appear in the 1300s, as most imagine. The Black Death, that first great horror, came and went with no beaks in sight. In fact, the most iconic symbol of plague, the long-nosed mask, would not be seen for nearly 3 centuries. When it finally did emerge, it wasn't born from myth or madness, but from reason. Or what passed for reason in the year 1619. The beak came from Paris, from the mind of a man named Charles Delorme. Delorme was no village physician. He was personal doctor to the Medici, to Louis XIII, to royal courts stretching across France and Italy, a man steeped in classical knowledge, trained in humors, balances, and the teachings of Galen, but he was also practical, observant, and frightened, like all the others, of the plague. In 1619, as plague smoldered across France once more, Delorme set out to build something new, something that could shield the physician not only from the disease itself, but from the fear that wrapped around it like smoke. He designed a costume, a full-body uniform made from head to foot to guard against the invisible poisons in the air. The heart of this design was the mask, a long, curved beak fashioned from stiff leather or papier-mâché, arched several inches forward from the face. Inside the hollow snout, Delorme instructed that fragrant substances be packed tightly rose petals, cloves, mint leaves, camphor, and occasionally dried myrrh. The idea was simple. If plague came from miasma bad, corrupt air, then this nose would act as a filter, and the herbs inside would neutralize the poison. It was scent weaponized. The eyes were covered in round glass lenses. The rest of the body, arms, legs, torso was wrapped in waxed fabric or leather, sometimes even oiled canvas. Gloves protected the hands. A wide-brimmed hat shielded the top of the head, and a long wooden cane was carried, not as a walking stick, but to poke, prod, and keep distance from the dying. It was, by every standard, a bizarre creation, and yet it caught on. Across France and Italy, the costume became the new standard for plague doctors. In the decades that followed, it spread to Austria, to Prussia, and eventually even into the pages of medical textbooks. Though it looked absurd, there was method in its madness. But did it work? The answer is, not really. The mask filtered the air only through dried herbs, no true barrier against bacteria, which no one yet understood. The waxed robes may have helped repel fleas, the true carriers of plague, but they were imperfect. The cane offered distance, but not immunity. Doctors still fell ill, still died. The beak did not protect, yet it became something more than protection. It became a symbol, a theatrical costume for the drama of death. In Venice, children began telling stories about the man with the bird's face. In Prague, woodcuts were printed showing the doctor's silhouette against piles of the dead. In Paris, the costume became the subject of satire and ridicule. And yet, behind the mockery, a kind of fearful reverence remained. The beak doctor was no longer just a physician, he was a harbinger. When he walked into a village, people wept. Doors were slammed shut. Curtains drawn. His mask was the mask of doom. But Delorme's design was more than just fashion. It was a philosophical statement. It marked the beginning of something subtle, but seismic, the idea that disease could be stopped by structure, by fabric, by order. For the first time, a physician's body was turned into a sealed container, armored against the outside world. It was a prototype, crude and misunderstood, for what centuries later would become the modern hazmat suit. In a world that could not yet see germs, Delorme tried to build safety. He did not succeed, but he pointed in the right direction, and so the beak endured, even as doctors continued to die. Even as the plague returned again and again like the tide, the costume was passed down, reused, modified. In some cities, plague doctors were required to wear it by law. In others, they avoided it, fearing the ridicule or the superstition. But everywhere, the image grew stronger, the Birdman, the masked priest of pestilence. And somewhere along the way, the line between doctor and omen vanished. Children were told to behave, or the plague doctor would come for them. Street performers dressed as the bird to mock the city fathers. Painters used the beak to symbolize sin, decay, even the devil himself. And through it all, the real doctors kept writing their grim little notes, recording symptoms, tallying corpses, hiding their faces behind leather and lens. Few survived long enough to leave memoirs, but the mask endured. In the next part, we will step inside the beak itself, examining the curious recipes that were once stuffed into its hollow nose, and the strange alchemy of 17th century medicine that tried to turn scent into salvation. It was not merely a mask. It was an entire philosophy distilled into herbs, stuffed into leather, pressed against the face like a shield against death. The beak of the plague doctor was not empty. Inside it held a concoction. A blend of fragrant, pungent, sometimes bizarre ingredients that were believed to hold back the tide of sickness. Each mixture was a miniature apothecary, packed into the dark space between life and the stench of death. They called it a pomander from the French pomme d'ambre or amber apple, but it was no fruit. It was a ball, a packet, a collection of perfumes meant to purify the air. The idea was simple. Since miasma corrupted, plague-bearing air was thought to be the source of illness, then surrounding oneself with good smells could drive it away. What made it into these beaks varied from city to city, doctor to doctor. Some filled them with dried rose petals and mint leaves. Others used juniper berries, cloves, cinnamon, or crushed myrrh. Vinegar-soaked sponges were common, camphor resin, frankincense. Even powder from ground ambergris whale bile hardened by time if one was wealthy or well-connected enough to afford it. In some cases, the recipes became elaborate rituals. In Venice, records show a doctor who packed his mask with a blend of rosemary, sage, marjoram, and lavender, all soaked in vinegar and dried in sunlight for 3 days. Another in Vienna preferred a thick wad of crushed garlic and tar. In London, one physician reportedly carried a strip of cloth soaked in a mixture of wine, camphor, and the ashes of burned pine cones. But none of these concoctions fought bacteria, because no one yet knew bacteria existed. To the doctors of the 17th century, the nose was not just a filter. It was a weapon. They believed the nostrils were gateways through which the foul humors of the world entered the body. A sweet scent, therefore, was more than just comforting, it was protective. Inhaling lavender was akin to bathing the lungs in purity. Smelling cloves, a form of internal cleansing. Each breath was a small act of defense. The irony is almost too bitter to swallow. The very tool that was meant to shield the doctor, the mask, the beak, the herbs offered, at best, psychological protection. If anything, the long snout may have helped a little by keeping the doctor's face farther from coughing mouths. But the plague came not through scent, but through fleas, through unseen bites, through rodents that darted between barrels and beds, bringing infection without odor or warning. Still, the doctors clung to their masks and their herbs. Because in the face of death, even superstition can feel like science. Some of them became obsessed with perfecting the recipe. In Geneva, a plague doctor named Alphonse wrote a treatise on aromatic defense, claiming that certain combinations of dried citrus peel, wormwood, and burnt clove could not only protect against plague, but strengthen the mind. He died within the month. In Rouen, another physician designed a 3-layer filtration system: dried herbs, then a linen cloth soaked in vinegar, then another layer of perfume. His diary ends abruptly, halfway through a sentence about throat ulcers. There were always new formulas, always new hopes, but all the while the plague raged on. And there was something else in the air, something harder to describe than scent. It was dread. The smell of death was not just rot and filth, but fear itself. Corpses in the street, the sick moaning in cellars, the burning of infected belongings, it all created an atmosphere of such choking horror that perhaps the herbs were not meant to cure anything at all. Perhaps they were a way to survive the idea of the plague, to hide the stench with something beautiful, to breathe through the mask and pretend, for just a moment, that the world was not falling apart. That illusion, however brief, may have been all the doctor had. There are letters from survivors who wrote of how the scent of the mask lingered in a room long after the plague doctor had gone. A sweet, sharp perfume, like spice and rot, like incense in a tomb, a smell they would never forget, a reminder that death had visited and passed them by. And so the beak remained full. Each doctor adjusted the recipe. Some burned herbs in censers and wafted them into the mask before sealing it on their face. Others changed the mixture daily, believing that stale herbs lost their power. A few even added tobacco or opium, seeking clarity or courage. But none found a cure. They found instead a ritual, a daily ceremony of breath and scent and silence, a way to keep walking through a world filled with corpses, a kind of medieval aromatherapy for the soul. And through it all they kept writing, lists, names, descriptions, the scent clinging to the paper like a ghost. In the next chapter, we turn to the cities. Venice, London, Marseille, each with its own rituals, its own laws, its own plague doctors. We will follow them through the alleys and canals, through the quarantines and pyres, to see what the mask looked like when worn in public, when worn not to hide but to be seen. The plague doctor did not walk in forests or fields. He walked in streets narrow, cobbled, crowded streets where death pressed close on every side. He belonged to the cities. And the cities, by the 17th century, had learned to expect the plague. In Venice, London, and Marseille, plague was not a surprise. It was an unwelcome visitor who returned again and again, sometimes after 5 years, sometimes 10, but always eventually. Each city developed its own rituals, its own rules, its own ways of coping. And at the center of these rituals stood the plague doctor. Venice was among the first to respond systematically. It was a city already accustomed to trade, disease, and containment. As early as the 1400s, Venice had established lazaretto's islands used to isolate arriving ships and the potentially infected people aboard them. These were grim places, stone buildings, iron bars, bleached linen, and silence. For 40 days' Quaranta journey, the route of the word quarantine crews waited, watched by officials and physicians. The plague doctor in Venice did not stroll. He patrolled. His presence was part of a civic contract. Hired by the Republic, assigned to specific districts, his role was official, bureaucratic. He was not a healer. He was a recorder of death. His job was to monitor symptoms, confirm cases, and report them to the Magistrato alla Sanità Venetian Health Authority. If the doctor confirmed plague, the family was quarantined. If someone died, the body was removed, quickly, quietly, and with minimal ceremony. The doctor might not speak. He would point, nod, write. He was not there to comfort. He was there to observe, and above all, to be seen. The costume in Venice was especially theatrical. It had to be. The doctor's appearance was designed not just for protection, but for visibility. The beak, the wide-brimmed hat, the long black robe, these were signals, warning signs. Like a bell, tolling in cloth and leather. When one was seen walking near the Grand Canal, children were pulled indoors. Shopkeepers shut their doors. The gondoliers turned their poles away. The plague doctor was the embodiment of emergency. In London, the plague returned in waves. The city suffered horribly in 1665 during the Great Plague. An estimated 100,000 people died, nearly a quarter of the population. Here, the plague doctor played a more chaotic role. Records are incomplete. Some were hired by parishes. Others came of their own accord. Few wore the full costume. Most were simply robed, masked, or wrapped in cloth soaked in vinegar. In poorer areas, plague doctors were often distrusted. Some were accused of spreading disease deliberately. Others were believed to steal from the dead. In truth, many were barely trained, desperate for work, and only marginally safer than the corpses they examined. Yet their duties were much the same: confirm death, advise isolation. Mark homes with red crosses and the dreaded words, "Lord have mercy upon us." These marks were painted onto doors, signs to all that plague was within. The doctor's job was to decide who would be locked inside and who would be carted away. Sometimes they were the only living visitor a household would see in days. One Londoner wrote in his diary, "He came to our door and did not knock, but stood and watched, and when I looked down at him from the upper window, he wrote a thing on his paper and walked away. And I knew then we were condemned." In Marseille, the plague came roaring back in 1720, despite quarantine efforts. A ship called the Grand Saint Antoine brought infection to the city, and within weeks, thousands were dead. The plague doctor returned. This time, the city tried to act quickly. Doctors were deployed with full costume, including the beaked mask, leather gloves, and robes sealed at the ankles and wrists with wax. Here, the mask was worn strictly by order. The doctors were not free to travel as they pleased. They were assigned zones, days, routes. They worked with the Gardes de Santé sanitation guards, who enforced house quarantines and helped remove the dead. The beak doctor became a fixture in the streets. Locals called them Docteurs Corbeau Crow doctors. The name suited them. With their black robes and bird-like faces, they resembled scavengers. Birds who circled the dying, they were not loved. But they were obeyed. In all these cities, the plague doctor had one power above all: documentation. He kept lists of the sick, lists of the dead, lists of the living suspected of exposure. He carried with him a ledger, often bound in leather, in which he scrawled the tally of the epidemic. These lists were submitted to the authorities. They became the numbers you now see in dusty records. Centuries later, death rolls, mortality charts, grim arithmetic, and yet for all this order there was always fear. Because the doctor, no matter how official, was still a man. And men grew ill, died, disappeared. Sometimes their corpses were found in alleys, half-robed, stripped by thieves. Other times they vanished, fled the city, leaving their masks behind. One Venetian record notes, "The doctor assigned to San Polo has not been seen in 3 days. We believe him to be either dead or gone." His ledger was found by the canal. Still, the costume endured. The beak, the robe, the cane, because the doctor was not allowed to disappear from the story. He had to be there. If not for healing, then at least for witnessing. In the next part, we will enter the homes. Follow the doctor into rooms sealed from the world. Rooms where the dying lay in silence, and the only voice was the scratching of a quill behind a leather mask. He does not knock. The plague doctor stands at the door, black-robed, masked, silent. A small paper is nailed to the frame. A red cross smeared in paint. The words Domini Miserere Nobis scrawled across the wood. Lord, have mercy upon us. Then the latch is lifted and he steps inside. The interior is dim. The shutters are closed. The air is thick. It is not just the smell of sickness, but the reek of isolation. Sweat, rot, candle wax. The faint metallic tongue of blood. Beneath it all, the ghost of something sweet, the herbs inside his mask. The only breath he will take today. He does not speak. He observes this is his duty. Inside the house, the sick lie on low beds or wrapped in blankets on the floor. Some groan. Others are silent, staring at the ceiling with hollow eyes. A child coughs. A woman whispers prayers. A man tries to rise and falls back, too weak to lift his own weight. All wait for one thing: judgment. The doctor's cane touches a shoulder, lifts a corner of cloth. He does not use his hands. The cane points to a boil swollen, black, full of pus. It points again to the neck, the groin, the armpits, buboes, confirmation. He nods. This house is infected. From his satchel, he removes a folded sheet of parchment and begins to write. The script is narrow, careful. A list of names, ages, symptoms. He writes the date, the address, and next to the final entry, moribundus dying. He does not ask for their stories. He does not pray with them. That is not his place. His job is to count. This was the true horror of the plague doctor, not that he carried a cure, but that he carried authority. His presence could condemn a household. One nod and the family was sealed inside. Boards nailed over the windows, guards stationed outside. No food except what was left at the doorstep. No exit. Sometimes they were locked inside with their dead. In some cities, London, Naples, Marseille, the Badas, could not be removed until a second doctor confirmed death. Until then, the corpse lay in the same room as the living. The stench rose. The fear grew. The doctor might visit twice in one day. On his second entry, he might find silence. He might find one name to write, or 5 or all. He wrote them without comment, quietly. Sometimes he drew a line through the first name and replaced it with a cross. That meant deceased. His writing was meticulous, neat, because these records would go to the authorities, and the city needed order even in the midst of chaos. But the houses were never orderly. Each visit brought new scenes of misery. A mother feeding water to a child already cold. A man singing to himself in delirium. An old woman clutching a rosary so tightly her fingers bled. One plague doctor in Vienna wrote, "I entered the home of a baker and his wife. There were 3 children. By the time I wrote the final name, the eldest had ceased breathing. The ink was still wet." These were not healers. They did not administer medicine. At most, they might lance a bubo with a heated blade or prescribe vinegar cloths. Often they simply stood and watched. Not because they didn't care, but because there was nothing else to do. Inside the mask, breath was shallow. The herbs dulled the stench, but not the horror. Some doctors reported hallucinations. Some wept behind the leather. Some grew numb. A doctor in Prague wrote, "The worst sound is not the coughing, it is the silence that follows." When the visit was complete, the doctor would signal to the guards. They would seal the house, paint the mark again. Sometimes they would toss a handful of lime across the threshold, as if dusting death with disinfectant. He would then move on to the next, 10, 12, 20 houses in a day. Each one a small theater of suffering. At night, he would return to his quarters, often a room above a lazaretto, or a chamber lent by the city. He would strip the robe and hang it near a brazier of burning herbs. The mask would be left on the windowsill, the beak facing outward like a grotesque sentinel. He might eat bread, drink watered wine, sit by candlelight and record the day's toll in his ledger. But he would not sleep well. Plague doctors were not heroes. They were instruments, witnesses. They existed in the terrible space between medicine and death, where nothing could be done, but everything had to be seen. Some broke. There are records of doctors abandoning their posts, fleeing in the night. Others grew strange, silent, withdrawn, obsessive. One was found burning his own records, muttering that names had no meaning anymore. Another refused to remove his mask for days at a time. He died with it on, but most continued. Not because they believed they could cure, but because they were the only ones left who hadn't turned away. In the next part, we will examine how the mask itself became a character, how artists and writers turned the plague doctor into a symbol of something more than disease, a figure of sin, death, and the absurd theater of human suffering. By now, the mask had grown a life of its own. What began as a practical, if misguided, attempt to ward off disease became something stranger. Something theatrical, symbolic. The beak, once stuffed with herbs to purify air, became the face of death itself. In the public eye, the plague doctor was no longer just a man in a robe. He was a character, a warning, a myth. It began with the artists. Woodcuts from the 1600s and 1700s show him striding through alleyways, cane in hand, flanked by heaps of corpses, In one popular engraving from Rome, he stands beside the dead, pointing toward a blackened sky as demons swirl above him. In another from Augsburg, he is portrayed with exaggerated bird legs and talons, part man, part monster. People laughed, nervously, because by then, the real horror was not the mask, it was the familiarity of it. People saw the beak too often. They saw it entering homes and never returning. They saw it pacing the docks, counting badas, pointing silently to children who could no longer breathe. The mask became a signal not just of illness, but of fate, a prophecy in leather and glass. And so the plague doctor stepped from the street into the realm of folklore. In France, he became the croque-mitaine, the boogeyman. In Italy, the beaked mask was folded into commedia dell'arte, the improvisational theater of satire and social commentary. The figure of Il Medico della Peste emerged, a plague doctor exaggerated for comedy, complete with absurd gestures and a waddling walk. The tragedy of the mask became farce, but behind the laughter, fear lingered. Even the theaters could not forget what the mask had once meant. It was more than costume. It was the memory of mass graves, of padlocked homes, of weeks when church bells rang not for weddings but for the dead every hour. And so the image began to evolve again. Writers took up the mask. Poets described it in verses dark and dreamlike. One German writer called the plague doctor a shadow with glassy eyes who comes when no one knocks and leaves behind silence. In London, pamphlets accused plague doctors of being servants of Satan sent not to heal, but to mark those already chosen for death. The superstition deepened. Some claimed that to see a plague doctor in a dream was a curse. Others said they could fly or pass through walls or appear only to those already infected. There were rumors that the beak contained poisons instead of herbs, and that the doctors used them to kill, not cure. These were fictions, but they spread faster than truth. By the 18th century, the image of the plague doctor had shifted almost completely. He was no longer a medical professional not in the public mind. He was a symbol, a figure of the in-between. Not quite alive, not quite dead, not angel, not demon, just present, always in the margins of books. Children doodled the mask. In the churches, people whispered about the man with the beak who watched the burials from a distance and never prayed. In one Italian folktale, the doctor is said to ride a black horse and drag a sack filled with time grains of sand that fall faster when he is near. And yet, behind all the fantasy, there remained the real men, exhausted, fearful, often unpaid. Some tried to protest the growing myth. Letters survive from a few who wrote, "We are not crows, not ghosts, not bringers of death. We are men with ink and cane." But the world no longer listened. The mask had eclipsed the man. And what a mask it was, long, curved, hollow, empty-eyed. No matter how many times it was drawn, painted, carved, it never lost its power. The beak pointed like an accusation. The round lenses reflected nothing. The voice behind it was muffled, distant, almost unreal. People began to report visions. A woman in Genoa swore she saw a plague doctor standing at the edge of a cemetery 2 days before the sickness reached her village. A sailor in Lisbon claimed the doctor had visited him in a dream, capping the end of his cane 3 times before vanishing. In neither case had a real physician been present. Still, the legend grew. It was not hard to believe. When plague strikes, logic often dies first. What remains is ritual, symbol, superstition. The mask, so strange and inhuman, became the perfect vessel for fear. It was both protection and omen, both costume and curse. Even today, centuries later, the beak persists. It appears on Halloween masks in horror films and Gothic art. It is the centerpiece of Venetian carnival ironic, given its origin. People wear it now for pleasure, for spectacle, for drama. But even in those settings, there is a chill beneath the feathers, a shadow behind the music. Because deep down, we remember. Not the man, not the doctor, but the shape, the silence, the scent of herbs in a dead man's mask. In the next part, we will return to the physicians themselves, the men behind the masks. Who they were, how they were chosen, and what drove them to walk into cities where no one else would go. He is faceless now. When we picture the plague doctor, we see the beak, the glass eyes, the cane. We do not imagine the man beneath. But he was there, always, breathing slowly behind the scented herbs, watching, writing, enduring. Who were these men? The truth is stranger than the myth. They were not saints. Not always physicians. Not heroes, at least not by design. More often they were second-rate doctors, local notaries, or even civil servants with no formal medical training at all. In many cases, they were outsiders hired because no one in the city would take the job. Plague doctors were, above all, expendable. In times of outbreak, cities across Europe, Florence, Naples, Marseille, Geneva issued urgent contracts. The language was clinical, a fixed salary. Food and lodging provided. Risk of death acknowledged but unprotected. The job? Tend to the infected. Count the dead. Report to the magistrate. Try not to die. Some were young and desperate, men who had studied medicine but lacked money or title. The plague offered them a chance and opening into a profession that otherwise remained closed to those without family names or royal patronage. Others were old, their careers behind them, drawn by a final paycheck or a last attempt at significance, and some were simply men with nowhere else to go. The cities did not care. They needed bodies. The position was not glamorous. It was, in truth, a form of civic sacrifice, and they knew it. One contract from Geneva, dated 1630, includes this line: "The appointed doctor shall not complain of the conditions, nor of the people, nor of the heat, nor the filth, nor the lack of sleep. He shall serve the city until his death or the end of pestilence, whichever comes first." The plague doctor was not expected to survive, and many did not. The mortality rate among them was staggeringly high. Their equipment, though elaborate, was ineffective. Their knowledge limited, their protection symbolic. Most cities did not even bother to keep a full roster of their doctors during plague years. The turnover was too fast. The deaths, too constant. Still, some names remain. There was Matteo Fucci, a Florentine barber surgeon who served during the outbreak of 1631. His letters describe entire households, gone silent overnight, and how he tied a bell to his robe so the infected could hear him coming and prepare their confessions. There was Dr. Johann von Spohn, a physician in Stuttgart, who kept meticulous records of bubonic symptoms and died weeks after performing an autopsy on a 12-year-old boy. There was Jacques Ferrand, a French doctor who believed that melancholy of the heart was the true cause of plague and attempted to treat patients with music and perfumes. He died in quarantine. And then there was Charles Delorme, the man behind the mask. Unlike most, Delorme was not a doomed provincial doctor. He was a royal physician, well-educated, well-connected, and remarkably long-lived. He created the beaked uniform in 1619 and lived to see it become infamous. He survived plague, political scandal, and war, dying at the age of 96. He was, in many ways, the exception. The rest lived and died in anonymity. Their homes were often assigned to them by city councils, small rooms in lazarettos or apartments above shuttered shops. They were not permitted to live among the healthy. Their clothes were burned after outbreaks. Sometimes their bodies were, too. Funeral rites were rare, monuments rarer, and yet their writings survived. A few left journals. Others, marginal notes in city ledgers, medical treatises, letters. In these scribblings we find men who were tired, overwhelmed, strangely methodical. They describe symptoms in calm Latin. They calculate death tolls. They sometimes pause to remark on a child's final words or the strange silence that falls in a house where everyone is gone. They do not cry in their writing, but the grief is there between the lines. One doctor wrote, "Today I examined 27. 6 were already dead. 2 were speaking to God, the rest." Soon there are also glimpses of defiance. A doctor in Bologna refused to wear the mask, calling it a bird's charade, and chose instead to wrap his face in wine-soaked cloth. He died faster than most. Another, in Zurich, insisted on playing his lute for patients, believing that beauty slowed death. There is no record of whether it did. Many had families they could not see. Letters to wives and children were written from isolation, often stained with candle smoke and strange herbs. Some were never sent. A few were buried with the doctors themselves in mass graves beside their patients. And yet, For all their failings, these men walked where others would not, into houses where death waited, through alleyways thick with the scent of burning clothes and lime, past churchyards so full that bodies were stacked like firewood. They went not to heal but to witness. They were the last eyes to see the dying, the last voices to whisper names, the last hands to write the truth. In the next part, we will turn from the doctor to the city. How entire urban systems tried to survive the plague with curfews, fire, bells, and the silent procession of the masked. The air smelled like vinegar and smoke. In a plague-stricken city, silence was never empty. It was dense, full of meanings. Doors stayed shut not out of peace but fear. Bells rang, not for weddings or hours, but for death. Footsteps echoed in alleys where only the desperate walked. And always, somewhere in the distance, a mask with a beak turned a corner and vanished. When plague came, it came like siege. Not from the outside, but within. The walls didn't protect you anymore. In fact, they locked you in. Cities that once boasted great stone ramparts, Florence, Lyon, Lubeck, became traps for their own people. The gates were sealed. The watchmen turned into guards. The streets became corridors of containment. Governments scrambled to control the chaos. But how does one manage an invisible enemy? They tried order, ordinances, charts, city councils appointed plague commissions, quarantine magistrates, sanitation officers, all with solemn names and terrified eyes. The first act was always the same: separation. Those showing symptoms were to be removed. Plague houses were marked sometimes with chalk, sometimes with a cross, sometimes with a rope tied across the door. Entire buildings became tombs. No one entered, no one left. Next came the barricades. In Venice, bridges between islands were destroyed to keep the sickness from spreading. In London, infected parishes were isolated with watchmen posted at corners, armed and under orders. In Avignon, a trench was dug around the city, and no one crossed without a priest's blessing and a physician's letter. Inside the walls, the city began to change. Markets emptied. Theaters closed. Public fountains were drained, their waters now seen as cursed. Bells were muffled. Schools vanished. The only traffic left was the cart, the slow, rumbling cart of the dead collector, and the silent step of the plague doctor behind him. Not all complied. Some resisted. Merchants bribed officials to keep their shops open. Priests hid infected family members in sacristies. Mothers disguised children's fevers with herbs and prayers. Rumors circulated of entire households who fled through sewers or over roofs, carrying the plague into clean neighborhoods. And so fear grew sharper. Soon cities resorted to fire. In Milan, officials ordered contaminated clothes and bedding burned daily. In Edinburgh, barrels of pitch were set ablaze in intersections to cleanse the air. Smoke filled the city like incense, but darker, thicker, a symbol of war against what could not be seen. The sounds of the plague were not only moans and weeping. There were small handbells rung by the infected to warn others. There were hammers sealing windows. There were the endless scratches of quills as clerks recorded death after death in the books of the dead. And always behind it, the slow creak of the doctor's cane on stone. Quarantine became ritual. In Ragusa, the first formal quarantine laws had existed since the 14th century. By the 1600s, most port cities followed suit. Incoming ships were held offshore for 40 days quarantagiorni, hence the name. Their passengers, baked in the heat, often sick already, watched from a distance by men with telescopes and suspicion. Inside the city, homes were quarantined too. If one person fell ill, the whole household was locked in. Boards nailed across doors, food delivered through small windows. Waste left to rot in the courtyard. Time passed strangely in those sealed rooms. Some called it penance, others called it slow death. And yet the city tried to continue. Notaries still scribbled wills. Bakers left bread on stone ledges for those afraid to speak. Messengers wore vinegar-soaked gloves. Messages were written on wax tablets, then burned after reading. A new etiquette emerged built not on courtesy but survival. The plague changed everything. In Florence, the government set up pest houses outside the city-grim hospital-like structures surrounded by high walls, where the infected were left to either recover or die. In Marseille, entire districts were converted to quarantine zones, patrolled by militia who had no training, only orders. And what of the dead? They filled the city like smoke. Too many for proper burial, too many for names. In some places, bodies were dragged through alleys at night, dumped into lime pits. In others, mass graves were dug on the outskirts, covered hastily with soil and prayers. Priests walked with incense and open Bibles, but even they did not linger. In the middle of all this stood the mask, the plague doctor walking between silence and screams, watching, recording, carrying his cane not as a healer, but as a judge, a witness, a reluctant herald. He became the city's conscience, or perhaps its ghost, because when the plague passed, and it always did, what remained were not monuments, not statues, but absences, empty shops. Broken doors, half-erased names in the parish registry, forgotten gardens. A silence that would echo in the stones for decades. The doctor would leave, or die, the mask would vanish. But the city, she would never be the same. In the next part, we will trace the rituals of death themselves. What happened when the mask arrived too late, and how the dead were honored or erased in the time of pestilence. It begins with a knock, or perhaps not even that. Sometimes it begins with silence, a door that doesn't open, a window left unshuttered, a dog barking inside an empty house, and then the smell, thick, metallic, lingering in the hot air. That's when they come, not the mourners, not the priests, the others, the men with carts, the ones who do not ask names. By the height of a plague outbreak, death is no longer a private affair. It becomes a system, a grim, bureaucratic rhythm. The plague doctor is only the first in a long line of professionals who process the end, and it was very much a profession. The dead collectors were among the most visible figures in a dying city. They wore oilcloth cloaks soaked in vinegar, gloves, and sometimes rough versions of the beaked mask. They were not physicians. Most were poor laborers offered wages few others would accept. The risk was total. Their job, enter plague houses, drag out the dead, and transport them to designated pits. They worked mostly at night. Their carts were low, iron-rimmed, with thick wooden wheels that groaned across cobblestones. Sometimes the dead were wrapped in sheets, sometimes not. Some cities allowed for a single bell ring per corpse, others forbade noise entirely. One collector in Naples wrote in 1657, "We do not ask the names anymore. The faces are changed. There is only weight. Some light, some heavy. We stack them with care, not love." Behind them, often watching, stood the plague doctor, not participating, not helping, but observing, confirming death, checking that the corpses bore the right marks, recording numbers in a leather-bound book that smelled of ink and ashes. Then came the burial. But it was not what we imagine. Church graveyards filled up within weeks. Priests could not keep pace. Some cities dug trenches outside the walls, deep, communal, anonymous. These were not places of mourning. They were sites of disposal. Lime was poured over the bodies to hasten decay. In Venice, barrels of lime were kept beside the pits. In Paris, a cart driver might dump 20 corpses into the same hole before covering it with a thin layer of soil and riding off again. Prayers were rare. Sometimes a priest stood by. Often he did not. In Protestant cities, there might be a psalm, read quickly, half heard. In Catholic towns, perhaps a hurried requiem aeternam dona eyes. But there were no candles, no flowers, no mourners in black. The ritual of grief had collapsed under the weight of numbers, and yet some tried. Families who could afford it paid for quick funerals, private burials in sealed plots, done before the body was too far gone. In Rome, special confraternities of laymen conducted these rites, risking their lives to maintain a thread of dignity. Others bribed grave diggers to delay burial, so a last prayer could be whispered through a door. In many cases, the plague doctor was tasked with confirming that death had indeed occurred. False deaths were feared. The stories of plague victims awakening inside burial carts clawing their way out terrified entire districts. So doctors tapped the eyes, checked the breath with a feather. Sometimes they burned a wick close to the nose. Still, mistakes were made. The line between sleeping, unconscious, and dead was thin, and the rush of death turned doctors into judges with seconds to decide. There were also rituals of purification. After a death, the house had to be cleansed. In Milan, city officers lit small fires in the rooms where death had occurred. Furniture was burned, walls whitewashed, floors doused with vinegar and rosewater. In Marseille, the entire building might be sealed for 40 days, its windows marked with black crosses. Neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and relief. The contagion, they hoped, had been contained. In some cities, lists of the dead were read aloud in town squares. In others, they were simply posted on church doors, long, impersonal registers. No ages, no biographies, just names, if even that. One such list survives from Leon, dated 1629. A page of it reads, Marie, T., servant Jean-Luc B., aged daughter of Marguerite I beggar. The plague erased identities even as it recorded them. The plague doctor, too, became part of this erasure. In their journals you find repetition, terse lines. A day's entry might read, visited 8 homes, 5 dead. Symptoms, buboes, fever, blackening, instructed removal, burned linens, and that was all. But in the margins, sometimes you find something more human, a note, a sketch, a question. One doctor in Prague wrote next to a list of the dead, what did she dream of before the fever? There were stories that the plague chose its victims with purpose, that sin called it forth, or that certain behaviors invited death. Doctors were told to observe, not judge, but they heard the rumors. They watched mothers die beside their children. They saw the rich by silence and distance. They knew who was left to rot. Death was not democratic. It only pretended to be. In the next part, we will examine the tools of the trade. Not the mask, but the cane, the gloves, the vials, and the books. How the plague doctor-esque kit became part of a strange and futile performance in the theater of death. In a world unraveling under the weight of disease, the plague doctor did not walk empty-handed. His appearance was unsettling, yes, but it wasn't just the mask, it was the gear. The total effect, a mobile theater of medicine, superstition, and fear. To the dying, he looked like death made visible. But each item he carried had a purpose, real or imagined. Let's begin with the most visible, the staff. Often carved from ash wood, long enough to keep distance, the cane was not just a walking aid. It was an extension of the doctor's hand. He used it to examine buboes, lift bed sheets, point at afflicted limbs, or push back panicked patients. Sometimes it was used to beat back crowds or ward off desperate beggars. More than a tool is, a symbol of authority. A silent way of saying, I do not touch. Then the gloves and boots. Made of thick leather, sometimes waxed or soaked in oil, they were meant to form a barrier. They did not know bacteria, but they feared miasma, the corrupted air said to carry plague. These garments were heavy, uncomfortable, and rarely cleaned. Instead, they were smoked. After each visit, doctors might wave their hands and boots through a small aromatic flame, believing it could chase away the sickness. Above all of it, the coat, long, dark, and ominous. Often made of wool or linen treated with wax, pitch, or camphor oil, it clung to the body like armor. In France and Italy, officials provided standard-issue coats to their plague doctors, black, hooded, reaching the ankles. In the Holy Roman Empire, some bore city emblems, making the doctor a sort of walking emblem of civic duty, but it was the mask that gave him his haunting silhouette. The beak. That long, curved snout wasn't a flight of theatrical design. It was practical, at least in theory. Within it, the doctor packed an array of herbs, dried flowers, spices, and oils. A kind of mobile apothecary, lavender, thyme, rose petals, mint, cinnamon, cloves, vinegar-soaked sponges. Anything thought to purify the air before it reached his lungs. He breathed through the beak. He smelled what was safe, or so he hoped. Behind the beak's twin nostrils were small holes. Behind those holes, scented gauze. Then air, then, finally, the doctor's breath. Some masks had sliding compartments, so the herbs could be replaced during the day. Others were sealed tight, waxed and laced with threads soaked in camphor oil. The doctor could not easily eat or drink while wearing it. But that was the point. To remove the mask was to risk everything. And still the eyes. Covered in glass, the eye holes distorted everything. The world became misted, shadowy, dreamlike. It dehumanized the man inside and masked whatever expression he wore. He could not be read, he was unreadable. And for many, that made him terrifying. He carried satchels and bottles, dozens of them. Some held rosewater, vinegar, or turpentine. Others contained ointments made of lard and herb spread on the skin to repel the bad humors. A few held mercury, ground pearls, or saffron, not cures. Not really, but symbols of effort, tools of observation, if not healing. He had writing instruments, too. A small ledger, quills wrapped in cloth, sealed ink pots. The plague doctor often served as an official witness to death. He took down names, ages, symptoms, time of death. He became a human archive. Not of lives, but of ends. One entry from a doctor in Bologna reads simply, House of Giovanni, 3 dead. Mother, 2 sons, father absent, left bread in a note. No signs of resistance. Buboes black. Eyes sunken, dogs growled. They weren't doctors in the modern sense. They didn't cure. They didn't save. They recorded. They moved from home to home like librarians of grief. Some carried amulets or charms, not officially of course, but many did. A saint's medal, a scrap of scripture, a tooth. A coin pressed to the chest before suiting up. In a world where science and superstition overlapped constantly, it wasn't unusual. No one mocked them for it. Even the rational men prayed. A few carried leeches. Others, lancets for bleeding patients. There were crude scalpels and cauterizing irons. Not to cure, but to balance the humors. A final gesture before death. Their bags smelled of mold, rust, and herbs. Each plague doctor's kit was slightly different. In Prague, one doctor kept crushed emeralds in a silk pouch. In Seville, another carried a string of dried lemons. In London, a man was known to carry a bottle of 4 Thieves vinegar, a popular plague remedy infused with rosemary, wormwood and garlic said to protect against infection. But they all carried one thing in common, fear. Not just the fear of the disease, but the fear of being mistaken for it. The costume blurred lines. People sometimes avoided the doctor more than the plague itself. In Milan, children reportedly cried at the sound of the plague doctor's staff tapping on cobblestones. In Vienna, windows were shuttered at the sight of his shadow. And when he left after examining a home, confirming death, or marking a door, he left behind not hope, but finality. In Part 12, we will dive into the myths and rumors surrounding these masked figures, how plague doctors became symbols of dread, harbingers of judgment, and eventually icons of horror across Europe. By the time the plague doctor appeared at your door, hope had already slipped out the back. He was not just a physician. He was a signal. His arrival told the neighbors what no one else dared to say aloud: this house is already marked. And so, as cities trembled beneath wave after wave of pestilence, the plague doctor became more than a man in a mask. He became a character in the collective nightmare, a myth walking in daylight. At first, the fear was rooted in reality. People did not understand how plague spread, but they knew it was lethal. The doctor's presence was associated not with healing, but with judgment. His role was often administrative, counting the dead, recording symptoms, and sealing homes with wax and ribbon. His gloved hand might post a quarantine notice on your front door. Or worse, he might draw the red X. That simple mark, made with chalk or ochre, signaled contagion. Inside, the sick were to remain by law, by force, or by starvation. Over time, this cold ritual became loaded with superstition. Some said the plague doctor could see death before it arrived, that his black robes were woven with curses, that if he pointed his cane at you like a priest at the pulpit, it meant your hours were numbered. A legend from 17th century Provence claims that a Dr. S mask had once been found buried under a plague pit, still intact, still reeking of rosemary. Local mothers warned their children, if you hear the crow at night, do not open the shutters. He walks again, the beak, already strange, grew monstrous in memory. Some villagers believed the doctor was not a man at all, but a demon in disguise. That the mask was not to filter air, but to hide a face twisted by dark knowledge. In parts of Germany, the figure became known as Der Pestvogel, the plague bird. In tavern whispers and churchyard tales, the costume took on a life of its own. They said the herbs in his mask were not protective but poisonous. that the doctor brought plague with him rather than shielding from it. One rumor insisted the cane was hollow and filled with infected powder he could release at will. Truth rarely fared well against terror. Even in the cities where doctors were paid and regulated, the public feared them. In Venice, it was recorded that plague doctors had to be escorted by armed guards through some districts, not to protect themselves from the sick, but from angry crowds who blamed them for the suffering. Their very uniform became the subject of art, ridicule, and horror. In 1665, a woodcut circulated in London depicting a plague doctor as a skeletal figure with clawed hands, a snout like a vulture, and robes trailing smoke. Below him, the caption read, "When the beak arrives, the breath departs." Others turned to humor. Satirical plays in Florence featured bumbling plague doctors as figures of mockery men obsessed with herbs and blind to suffering. But even laughter couldn't fully erase the unease. Every joke was a nervous one. Because people knew behind the beak was a man who saw more death than any priest. In rural villages, strange beliefs formed. That if you burned a drawing of the plague doctor at night, you could ward him off. That if you placed a mirror on your door, his reflection would scare him away. Some people even carved small wooden plague doctors and buried them under thresholds, a kind of reverse doll, meant to trap misfortune in effigy. And then came the dreams. Accounts from Marseille during the great outbreak of 1720 describe citizens reporting vivid nightmares of the doctor entering their rooms in silence, standing at the foot of the bed, unmoving. Some claimed they could hear his breath behind the mask. Others saw nothing but woke to a strange scent lavender and vinegar lingering in the air. Whether the doctor had actually visited, they did not know. But the fear was enough to make them confess their sins and prepare for death. The mask itself began to change in meaning. By the 18th century, it was no longer just a medical costume. It had become an icon of death, an omen. It crept into paintings, literature, even carnival masks twisted into something grotesque. In Venice's Commedia dell'arte, the character of Il Medico della Peste, the plague, doctor wore a stylized beaked mask long after the real doctors had vanished. People wore it to masquerades. They laughed in its face. But behind the performance was a memory too deep to erase, a memory of doors nailed shut, of carts rolling at dawn, of a man who did not speak, but whose arrival meant silence. Even centuries later, when the science improved and plague retreated, the image lingered. In novels, in etchings, in horror films, the beak, the black robe, the glass eyes. Why does it endure? Because the plague doctor, in truth, was never just a doctor. He was a mirror of our helplessness. A walking contradiction, reason wrapped in superstition, medicine wrapped in ritual, life wrapped in death. In the next part, we'll examine what daily life was actually like for a plague doctor, how they were treated by society, how they coped with constant exposure to suffering, and how some of them vanished without a trace. You would think that the plague doctor, grim and shrouded as he was, might have commanded respect. He did not. Not in the way a modern physician might. Not like a trusted healer, invited into homes with warm smiles and desperate hope. Instead, the plague doctor was regarded with suspicion, with pity, and more often with fear. He walked alone. Because while he was appointed by the state, paid from the public coffers, and often educated in medicine or philosophy, he lived on the margins of the very society he was hired to protect. For many, he was not a savior, but a sign that salvation had failed. Imagine it. A man assigned to walk among the dying day after day. A man who cannot touch, cannot comfort, cannot remove his mask, not even to weep. He wakes, if he sleeps at all, to silence. The streets are quiet, no laughter, no morning chatter. Only the rustle of crows and the distant muffled wailing from shuttered homes. He eats alone, he prays alone. He often sleeps in an isolated barrack on the edge of town or in a building specially designated by the city council. In some cases, he is given a sealed room within a hospital or even forced to live within the lazaretto itself, surrounded by the infected. He is, in a way, one of them. Neither clean nor unclean, not sick, not well, not hated, not beloved, just ... present, and that, in plague-ridden Europe, was a dangerous thing to be. Some plague doctors were forbidden from speaking directly to the public. Others were not permitted to marry or have children during their service. A few were barred from entering churches or taverns for the duration of their assignment. Their clothing was often burned after each wave of plague. Their masks, when retired, were buried or destroyed. The job paid well, but not because it was noble, because it was dangerous. A record from Avignon shows a doctor being offered double the annual wage of a city lawyer provided he would work in the infected quarter. In Vienna, one contract included a clause for the payment of the Dr. S family should he die in service, but many of them had no family left, or none willing to claim them. Some plague doctors were foreigners. This in itself bred mistrust. Cities often recruited physicians from outside, believing they would be more impartial, less entangled in local affairs. But when the sick began dying faster, suspicion grew. Were these outsiders really here to help? Or were they agents of some darker scheme sent to spread death under the guise of healing? It didn't take much to ignite such rumors. In 1656, during the Naples plague, a foreign doctor was accused of poisoning wells. No trial, no evidence. Just fear and the speed with which it moved through narrow alleyways. Other doctors vanished without explanation. Whether they fled, succumbed to illness, or were quietly removed by desperate citizens, no one knows. Their names appear in early city rosters, then disappear like breath in winter. Of those who stayed, few kept diaries. Fewer still wrote letters. Most of what we know comes from tax records, medical registries, and city council minutes. There is a loneliness to those documents, a chilling regularity. June 2, Dr. Gallo appointed to the Porta San Giorgio quarter. June 15th, house at Via Delordo sealed, family deceased. July 4th, no sign of Dr. Gallo, replaced by Dr. Zanni. Gone, just like that, and still the work continued. Each day, the plague doctor ventured from one home to the next. Sometimes he was met with silence, just bodies, stiff and cold. Sometimes with screams, sometimes with prayers, always with eyes that watched him through shutters, from rooftops, from alleyways. He was marked, even when the mask came off. Some doctors reported being shunned even after the plague ended. Children crossed the street to avoid them. Merchants refused to take their coins. Women touched the hems of their sleeves and whispered blessings. It was as if the stench of plague clung to them forever. Some tried to cleanse themselves through ritual visiting churches, bathing in spring water, burning all their clothes. But others simply disappeared, choosing to live in remote countryside towns under new names. There are stories, perhaps, only legends of plague doctors who turned mad, who kept wearing the mask long after the crisis had ended, who spoke only in whispers, who refused to let anyone touch them. And then there were those who became silent heroes. Men like Matthias Gottfried Perman in 17th century Germany, who not only treated patients during the Great Plague of Vienna, but also documented his findings meticulously, hoping to spare future generations. Or Charles Delorme, the royal physician often credited with designing the iconic beaked costume. He served during multiple outbreaks, treating nobles and peasants alike. He survived, wrote, and lived long enough to see the costume he created become a symbol of fear. But most, their stories are lost, their masks buried, their names forgotten. Only the silhouette remains. In part 14, we will follow what happened after the plague doctor disappeared, how the figure faded from history, only to be resurrected centuries later as a terrifying image in art, media, and popular culture. There was no funeral, no solemn farewell for the figure in the beaked mask, no day when Europe collectively laid him to rest. No monument, no tombstone, no official declaration that the plague doctor was gone. And yet, by the early 1800s, he had vanished. The last major European plague outbreaks had receded. The terrifying shadows of bubonic death began to loosen their grip. The quarantine walls came down. The lazarettos closed. The bells tolled less often, and so did the plague doctor fade. He did not evolve like the physician's white coat or the surgeon's sterile gloves. He simply stopped appearing, quietly, without ceremony. You would not have noticed it immediately. But within decades, the once familiar black-robed silhouette disappeared from the corners of public life. The governments no longer hired them. The towns no longer recorded them. The masks no longer hung in city hospitals. What had once been a practical costume shield against disease, born from misunderstanding and desperation, became little more than an artifact, a curiosity, a relic of medical superstition. But he was not forgotten, not really, because something strange happened in the years that followed. The plague doctor died as a profession but was reborn in imagination. At first, he lingered in folklore. Old wives in Tuscany still warned children not to play in basements where the Birdman walks. In southern France, it was said that whistling after dark could bring the doctor's attention. No one said his name. They didn't have to. He had become something like a ghost. Then came the artists. In Venice, during the carnival resurgence of the 19th century, masks returned to the streets. They had always been part of the Venetian spirit elaborate, theatrical, and ornate. But now, among the feathered columbinas and the gilded bautis, there reappeared a strange old face. The long beak, the round, hollow eyes. It was a grotesque exaggeration, no longer made of leather and brass, but of papier-mâché, painted in silver and gold. It was not worn to ward off disease. It was worn to provoke wonder, laughter, even fear. The doctor had become a costume. By the 1880s, prints and woodcuts of plague doctors circulated again, not in medical texts, but in satirical almanacs and carnival posters. The figure was reshaped into a caricature, part historical joke, part theatrical prop, and then history turned darker. The 20th century arrived with new horrors. 2 world wars, gas masks, trench warfare. And suddenly the imagery of faceless, masked figures in long coats didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt familiar, uncomfortably so. Artists in Weimar Germany began drawing plague doctors again not as physicians but as symbols of decay. Death in disguise. The beaked mask appeared in expressionist paintings, looming over crumbling cities. It became a metaphor, the false promise of science, the silent march of fate. In literature, too, he crept back in. Thomas Mann's death in Venice makes no direct mention of the plague doctor, yet the mood of impending sickness, of masks and silence, echoes his presence. In other stories, the figure was reimagined as a harbinger not of healing, but of collapse. By the late 20th century, the beaked mask had fully crossed into the realm of horror. You've seen him in Halloween costumes, in heavy metal album covers, in grim dystopian video games, in haunting comic books and stylized films. He appears again and again, sometimes faithfully, sometimes grotesquely exaggerated, but always with the same unsettling form. The beak, the eyes, the black coat. He became a visual shorthand for plague, for death, for helplessness. During the COVID-19 pandemic, his image returned in force. Social media filled with drawings and memes. Some were humorous social distancing since 1348, one caption joked. Others were chilling. Empty cities, modern doctors in plastic suits, and in the corner, always the echo of the past. The plague doctor became a meme, a symbol, a warning. He even appeared in fine art once again. In 2020, several contemporary artists used his silhouette in exhibitions on pandemic trauma. One sculpture showed a beaked figure made of glass fragile, cracked, hollow. Another displayed a plague mask made of white surgical gloves, twisted and sewn into form. Why does he endure? Because he was never just a medical figure, he was a projection, a canvas. We looked at the mask and saw our worst fears reflected back at us. Disease, death, isolation, the cruelty of chance, the frailty of knowledge. The real plague doctors, the men who walked into infected homes and took notes in candlelight, those men are mostly forgotten. But their shadow, it is longer now than it ever was. In part 15, we'll step back into the plague years themselves to explore the forgotten patients, the voices we never hear, the mothers and beggars and children whose lives brushed against the mask, and then ended in silence. We talk about the plague doctor, we talk about his mask, his gloves, his strange bird-like silhouette drifting through narrow streets, but we rarely talk about the people he visited. Not the nobles who fled to their countryside estates, nor the mayors who issued quarantine edicts from afar. No, the ones who truly met the plague doctor face to face were the poor, the forgotten, the already dying. We know so little about them. They didn't leave behind journals or testimonies. No one asked them what it felt like to be sealed in a home with rotting food, family members collapsing, and a strange masked figure at the door. They didn't write poems about their final hours. They were simply swallowed by silence. And the silence is vast. Take a town like Ayam in England, which famously self-quarantined in 1665. Whole families were wiped out. Grave diggers couldn't keep up. The church recorded names, but beyond that, we know almost nothing about what those people actually lived through, only that they died, and that someone often wearing a beaked mask stood over them at the end. What did it feel like to see that mask? To watch it appear at the threshold, flanked by guards, perhaps holding a long stick to prod or examine from a safe distance? To realize that your cough, your fever, your sore neck had marked you? The beak mask wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. And it was final. Many patients knew exactly what it meant. The mask didn't come from mild cases. It came when the swelling began, when the black blotches appeared on skin, when the breath grew shallow. The beak doctor often arrived too late to heal, but just in time to make things official. There are rare glimpses into their experience, scattered, fragmented, barely legible across the centuries. One midwife in Naples scratched a message into her wall before she died. I stayed with the children. Tell their mother I was not afraid. A boy in Lyon, too weak to speak, supposedly wrote cold in the dust beside his bed. He was found dead by the time the guards came to remove him. These are stories passed down in whispers. Maybe they're true, maybe not. But they are what we have. Most plague victims died alone. Some were locked into their homes with family members who were already corpses. Others were forced into pest houses, makeshift quarantine centers where the sick were herded together, often without care, without food, without names. If a plague doctor came at all, he rarely spoke much. He asked questions, he took notes. He poked with his cane. If instructed, he might bleed the patient or offer camphor, garlic, or vinegar. He did what he could. Sometimes it helped. Mostly it didn't. There are no accounts written by plague patients themselves. No one lived long enough or healthily enough to describe what it was like to hear the door open and see that mask. Only outsiders wrote it down, monks, priests, or the occasional survivor. To them, the patients were statistics. Numbers in the death registers, anonymous entries, but they were people. There was a girl in Venice whose family died one by one. She fed them until the food ran out, then lit candles for them every evening, even as her own fever rose. Her name was Isabetta. That's all we know. A friar wrote it in the margin of a ledger. In Hamburg, an apothecary mentioned a baker who kept giving away bread, even when he was coughing blood. No one dared to stop him. He was found dead in his shop with flour still on his sleeves. These stories survive in cracks and corners. And what binds them together? The thing they all have in common is the mask? That silent, faceless doctor who came at the end. Not a healer. Not a villain. Just a shadow passing through the lives of people who had already been forgotten by history. We remember the beak. But we forget the faces that stared up at it. And maybe that's the most haunting thing of all. There was a time when the plague doctor was just a man. A hired official paid a flat rate to monitor the dying, scribble notes, and occasionally offer herbs and advice. He wore a strange outfit, yes, but he was not, in his own time, a figure of horror. That came later. Centuries after the last beaked doctor vanished into the footnotes of medical history, his ghost came back transformed. The beaked mask, once meant to protect, had become a symbol of death, a walking omen, a theatrical villain. But how? How did this obscure medical figure become a cultural nightmare? The answer lies in a curious mix of folklore, politics, and the human love for the grotesque. We begin in the theater. By the late 1600s, the Commedia dell'arte was flourishing in Italy and France. Traveling troupes of actors brought bawdy, satirical plays to marketplaces and courts. Among their colorful cast of stock characters was one who stood out, Il Medico della Peste, the plague doctor. He was not wise, he was not kind, he was ridiculous. Portrayed with a long nose, a hunched gait, and an obsession with bodily fluids, The comedic plague doctor was mocked as a bumbling fool, a quack. He spouted fake Latin and misdiagnosed everything. His cures were absurd, his potions poisonous. The real doctors, naturally, were not amused, but the image stuck. As the Enlightenment rolled in, and science began to rise above superstition, the memory of the actual plague doctor began to fade. But his theatrical counterpart, beaked, black-robed, and incompetent only, grew more vivid. In pamphlets, he was depicted as a fraud. In paintings, he loomed behind the dying. By the 18th century, he had ceased to be a person and become a caricatural warning against ignorance and eventually a boogeyman. In Eastern Europe, the image warped even further. Folk stories began to merge the plague doctor with older spirits of death. In some versions, he became a supernatural figure, the bird-faced man who came to the window and whispered a name. The person would die within days. Some villagers placed herbs in their windows not to prevent plague, but to ward off him. In German folklore, children were told, "If you see the man with the beak, do not speak. He will carry your voice away." These stories were never official, but they spread, and the beak doctor, long dead, began to haunt the margins of Europe's nightmares. By the 19th century, medical illustrations stopped portraying him altogether. He was outdated, irrelevant, a relic of pre-modern medicine. But in the shadowy corners of popular imagination, he continued to fester. Then came photography. In the early 20th century, artists and writers rediscovered the strange silhouette of the plague doctor. They found old etchings, woodcuts, and marginalia. They were fascinated. Gothic novels and early horror films began to experiment with the image. By the time World War I ended, the beaked mask was no longer medical. It was monstrous. In Germany and Austria, expressionist filmmakers like Robert Wien and Fritz Lang used plague imagery-sick towns, masked figures, and slow, eerie deaths to explore fear and decay. The plague doctor's costume, though rarely named, made subtle appearances. By the 1920s, he was part of horror. And then came the 21st century. With the internet, the plague doctor found new life. Artists on DeviantArt, Tumblr, and later Instagram and TikTok embraced the look. Black cloak, bird mask, empty eyes. Sometimes sad, sometimes sinister, always haunting. Video games featured him as a villain. Cosplayers recreated the outfit with terrifying precision. Halloween masks flooded the market. Horror films leaned in. But with every new portrayal, the original truth slipped further away. The man who once walked the alleys of Marseille or Venice, tired and overworked, checking pulses with shaking hands, was gone. In his place stood a symbol, a scarecrow of death, a faceless omen. Ironically, this transformation says more about us than about him, because we fear the things we don't understand. And in the plague doctor, we see the perfect vessel for that fear, a figure who arrives too late to save, who wears a mask instead of a face, who speaks no comfort and leaves no cure. He is not just history's ghost, he is a mirror, and we made him a monster. In part 17, we'll explore how real plague doctors responded to fear, how their presence sparked riots, religious outrage, and even political uprisings. Because sometimes people didn't just fear the mask, they fought it. The beaked mask was meant to soothe. That's the strange irony of it all. Its intention was never to terrify, it was designed to reassure. To show that someone, somewhere, still cared enough to enter the dying city, to catalog the bodies, to make a gesture at medicine. But that's not how people always saw it. To the terrified, starving, desperate citizens who watched their neighbors drop dead in the streets, the arrival of a plague doctor could feel like a death sentence. And sometimes it did more than frighten. Sometimes it provoked fury. In Marseille, during the outbreak of 1720, the plague doctor was not always welcomed as a healer. When Dr. Chirac, an educated physician from Montpellier, arrived with his black robes and long beak, people whispered that he wasn't a doctor at all. They said he was a government spy. Or worse, a poisoner. Whispers turned to shouts. Shouts turned to stones. Chirac was driven from more than one street by mobs who believed he had come not to heal the sick, but to spread the plague himself. It wasn't just France. In parts of Italy, plague doctors were accused of being death merchants, men paid by the ruling class to thin the population, especially the poor. Some carried symbols of church authority, wearing crucifixes and carrying seals. Others came under cover of night, escorted by armed guards. In both cases, the people often reacted with suspicion and rage. In Milan in 1630, plague officials attempted to quarantine entire neighborhoods. Residents responded with riots. They barricaded themselves inside. When a plague doctor came to mark the doors with chalk signifying the house was infected, he was dragged into an alley and beaten. His mask was torn apart. The papers in his satchel were burned. This wasn't just resistance. It was rebellion against death itself. Because in the minds of the people, the plague doctor wasn't simply a man in costume. He was an agent of fate, a walking omen, a sign that you or someone you loved was already as good as gone. In one case, the arrival of a doctor sparked an entire village uprising. In the Hungarian countryside during the Great Plague of 1738, a rumor spread that plague doctors were kidnapping children to test cures. A single Dr. Young, nervous and newly assigned, walked into a market and was promptly chased by a furious crowd. He escaped only by hiding in a grain silo for 2 days. Even religious communities were not immune to panic. In Orthodox regions of Eastern Europe, the mask was seen as a profane abomination, something unnatural. There were cases of villagers throwing holy water at plague doctors, shouting that they were demons or witches. One priest refused to allow a plague doctor into his church to examine the sick, declaring the beaked figure a mockery of God's face. The fear wasn't always irrational. Some plague doctors were corrupt. Records show several were caught extorting bribes to falsely declare homes plague-free so wealthy families could avoid quarantine. Others looted from the dying, stealing jewelry, silverware, and coins before the corpse collectors came. Even worse were the ones who simply vanished, hired by desperate towns, paid in advance, and given a mask and coat only to disappear at the first sign of sickness. It's not hard to imagine why people came to see the beaked man not as salvation but betrayal. But the fear ran deeper than corruption. What truly terrified people was what the mask represented. The beak meant quarantine. The mask meant your door would be nailed shut, your food left outside once a day, your dog or cat killed to stop spread, your family burned if they died too quickly. It meant priests wouldn't come, friends wouldn't visit. You were on your own, and the mask would watch impassive, silent, and grim. In cities like Prague, walls were defaced with drawings of plague doctors always looming, always bird-like. Children were told not to speak to the bird man. Mothers whispered, "If you're bad, the doctor will come and take you away." By the 18th century, the mask had lost even the illusion of mercy. And yet, through all the fear and hatred, some doctors kept going. They walked the streets, ducked rocks and insults, entered plague houses, and marked the sick with chalk. They recorded symptoms. They counted the dead. They risked their lives. They were not always good men, but many of them were brave. They walked into fire while others ran away, and still, the people hated them. In Part 18, we'll look at what happened after the plague years ended, how the doctors were remembered, what became of the costumes, and why, for so long, history tried to forget the beak altogether. The final years of the plague era came not with a bang, but a slow, silent fading. City by city, continent by continent, the Black Death receded. Whether through changes in climate, improvements in quarantine, or simply the mysterious ebb and flow of pathogens, the worst was over. And so too was the career of the plague doctor. The beaked mask that once stalked Europe's diseased streets did not retire to museums or textbooks. It disappeared, quietly, almost deliberately. There were no grand ceremonies, no preserved uniforms, no monuments to the strange men who wore bird-like disguises in the name of medicine. There were only whispers, a few satirical drawings, and the memory of dread. It is no accident that we almost forgot them. As Europe embraced the Enlightenment, science began its slow but determined march toward germ theory, antiseptics, and sterile hospitals. The plague doctor, the man of stuffed herbs, superstition, and symbolic protection, no longer fit the narrative of progress. He was quite simply embarrassing. How could an era so proud of its scientific awakening admit that just a century earlier, its best defense against the most terrifying disease in history was a long stick, a leather robe, and a hollow bird's beak, so the record's thinned. Many plague doctors never had proper medical training, and even fewer kept detailed notes. Most were temporary hires, paid little, resented much. When they died often from the very plague they tried to avoid, they left behind little more than debts and fear. Their outfits, if they ever fully existed as we imagine them, were discarded, burned, or forgotten. There are no complete original plague doctor costumes in any known museum. What we think of today, black robes, waxed hats, long gloves, and the infamous mask is a reconstruction based largely on a few mid-1600s engravings and descriptions, many of them mocking or metaphorical. One of the most famous is Dr. Schnabel von Rahm, a satirical print from 1656. The image shows a robed figure with clawed gloves and a beaked mask, accompanied by rhyming verse mocking the doctor's supposed expertise. It wasn't a scientific document, it was a political cartoon, a warning, a joke, or perhaps both. And yet, that cartoon became history. With time, the absurdity of the plague doctor outfit made it disappear from serious historical discussion. Medical textbooks focused on the heroes of vaccination and antiseptics Jenner, Lister, Pasternak on the anonymous masked men who poked at buboes and recited prayers. Only a few historians kept the thread alive. Somewhere in the margins of old documents and forgotten libraries, bits and pieces remained. Mentions of contracts that required plague doctors to remain in infected cities, notes about the cost of their protective costume, descriptions of their duties, their failures, their deaths, but they were footnotes, sidelined until they came back. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as pandemics like cholera and tuberculosis resurfaced, interest in the history of disease was rekindled. Writers of Gothic fiction began invoking plague-era imagery. Even if distorted masked figures, corrupt physicians, death cloaked in ceremony. Then, in medical oddity books and early museum catalogs, the plague doctor began to reappear, slowly, as myth, as metaphor, but not yet as a symbol of horror. Not yet as a cultural icon. That would come later. In the modern world where digital archives, internet memes, and historical curiosities can resurface with viral speed, the beaked mask has taken on new meaning. In some ways it's a resurrection, in others a reinvention. But back then, in the quiet aftermath of plague, there was no interest in resurrection. Europe wanted to forget. Forget the bodies stacked like firewood. Forget the fear in the streets. Forget the helplessness of medicine wrapped in leather and carrying a stick. The Enlightenment didn't just usher in a new age of knowledge, it tried to seal off the dark corridors behind it. And so the plague doctor was erased, not by decree but by silence, until he returned. Not as a man of science, but as a shadow. Some symbols refused to die. The plague doctor, with his black robes and eerie beaked mask, once stalked the streets of infected cities. Then he vanished, largely forgotten for centuries. But in the strangest twist of historical irony, he has returned not as a medical professional, not even as a real memory, but as something else entirely, a specter of our collective imagination. It began subtly. In the late 20th century, the plague doctor started reappearing in art and literature no longer as a historical figure, but as a visual shorthand for death, dread, and disease. Horror films began to use the mask. Indie comics gave it a sinister elegance. Designers and costumers recreated the look, not to educate, but to unnerve. Why? Because it works. There is something viscerally wrong about the plague doctor mask. The long beak, the blank eye holes, the utter absence of expression. It's not human, but not quite inhuman either. It floats in that uncanny valley where memory and nightmare meet. A bird that does not fly, a doctor who cannot heal, and that made it perfect for the modern age. The internet gave it wings. In online forums, urban legend websites, and early creepypasta communities, images of plague doctors began circulating as avatars of mystery. People didn't know their original meaning, but that didn't matter. The image told a story all by itself of ancient rituals, of forgotten horrors, of masks worn while the world burned. In the video game world, plague doctors took on a new life. Characters inspired by them appeared in gothic horror games like Bloodborne, where their robes and beaks signified wisdom twisted into madness. In role-playing games, they became alchemists, necromancers, or scholars driven insane by forbidden knowledge. Suddenly, everyone knew the look even if they didn't know the history. On YouTube and TikTok, modern plague doctors began appearing as mascots of morbidity. Some channels featured silent characters in black robes giving cryptic advice. Others leaned into the theatricality, turning the beaked doctor into a kind of dark clown. The mask, so deeply rooted in death, had now become entertainment. And then came 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic brought the old fear roaring back. Quarantines, infection maps, images of crowded hospitals, the fear of breathing the same air. All of it felt eerily familiar, though most people couldn't quite place why. And soon the plague doctor returned again, this time as meme, mascot, and metaphor. People shared photos of themselves in homemade plague doctor outfits, beaks stuffed with sage or lavender. It was satire. It was stress relief. But it was also something else, a subconscious reaching back through time, a strange comfort in ritual. In the illusion that we had seen this before, Etsy shops sold thousands of plague doctor masks. Cosplayers wore them to virtual conventions. Twitter accounts popped up under names like at @BEAKYMedic or at Mascuffdoom, offering darkly humorous pandemic advice. Some wore the costume to protests mocking the state of modern medicine or the failure of public health systems. Others wore it simply because it felt right. In a world where the enemy was invisible, intangible, and everywhere, the plague doctor offered a symbol. Something to point at, something to wear, something to blame, something to become. Even conspiracy theorists adopted the image. In dark corners of the internet, the mask was twisted into a symbol of government control or secret plagues. It appeared in cryptic videos, RGs, and doom-laden prophecies. The same way people in the 17th century saw the mask and assumed death had come, the modern mind saw the mask and whispered, "They know something we don't." But not all revivals were dark. Some artists reimagined the plague doctor as a gentle, tragic figure, an overworked healer burdened by centuries of suffering. Graphic novels portrayed them as saints of sorrow. Children's books, believe it or not, began including stories of plague doctors who helped lost spirits or guided the sick to peace. And so the mask evolved again. It became a Rorschach, a mirror we hold up to our fears. For some, the plague doctor is a reminder of cruelty, of how society treats the sick, the poor, the expendable. For others, it's a symbol of protection, even if it failed. A uniform for the brave, a relic of those who walked into the fire while others fled. It is strange to think that an outfit no one really wore for very long could have such power. Stranger still that it continues to speak across centuries. But the truth is, the plague doctor never really left. He just changed shape, changed meaning, changed time. What is it about the beak? It's been centuries since a real plague doctor walked a cobblestone street, his stick in hand, eyes clouded behind glass lenses, herbs stuffed in the cavity of his grotesque mask. No one today consults a physician who looks like a monstrous bird. The methods have changed. The medicine has changed, and yet the image survives. Perhaps even more now than it ever did in life. The plague doctor should be a forgotten relic, a failed experiment, a brief macabre footnote in the long, painful history of human attempts to ward off death. Instead, he's become something else, something stranger, a symbol, a mask we keep putting back on. Ask someone today what a plague doctor is, and they'll likely picture the long-nosed mask. They may not know the history, the origins, the limited use of the outfit in 17th century Italy or France, but the look is burned into the modern mind. It's on t-shirts. It's at Halloween parties. It's in video games, on Reddit threads, in paintings and plush toys and protest signs. It's used to frighten, to joke, to teach, to warn. But what does it really mean now? To some, it has a symbol of historical horror, a face worn during one of the darkest chapters in human history, a visual shorthand for disease, fear, and helplessness. To others, it's defiance, a costume once meant to protect, now worn playfully, even proudly in the face of modern pandemics. A way to laugh at what once terrified, a reminder that we survived. But underneath it all is something deeper. Because the plague doctor didn't just wear a mask, He was a mask, a fiction. A figure made up to stand between the sick and the well. Not a man, not quite, not a healer, not really. Just a presence, an idea. A last-ditch effort to make sense of death by giving it a costume. And maybe that's why we keep bringing him back. We still live in a world that's afraid. Afraid of new diseases, old systems, collapsing trust. Afraid of what we cannot see, cannot smell, cannot stop. In those moments, we reach for masks, not just the literal kind, but symbolic ones, archetypes, rituals. We summon the plague doctor. He walks silently across our imaginations, his long beak sniffing the air, his gloves twitching, his robes rustling like wings. He is the ghost of medicine past. The reminder that we didn't always know, that we still don't. The great irony is that the plague doctor never cured anything. He had no vaccines, no antibiotics, no microscopes. He was little more than a warm body in a costume, and yet people wanted to believe. Belief gave them structure. A man in black with a beak was better than the invisible unknown. Today, we know better, or we think we do. We have epidemiologists, data models, mRNA vaccines. But in moments of true fear, all that rationality trembles, and the old images return. The ones that made death feel visible, if not stoppable. The ones that gave fear a face. The plague doctor is a paradox. He's absurd, but also terrifying. He's historical, but also timeless. He was real, but barely. He was forgotten, then remembered. He was mocked, then revered. He was a failed protector. But he's become something more enduring than any cure. He's become a story. And that's the final truth. The mask survives because it tells a tale we still need to hear. Not just of disease, but of desperation. Not just of medicine, but of myth. It reminds us that knowledge is fragile, that fear is ancient, that our ancestors also tried, failed, and tried again, and that even the strangest of symbols can find new life in every era of uncertainty. So the next time you see that bird-like face, don't laugh too quickly. Don't dismiss it as just a quirky bit of historical cosplay. Look at it closely, because behind the beak is not just a doctor from long ago. It's us, looking for protection, wearing our own masks, and trying still to make sense of death.